Thank you all for being here this afternoon. Good afternoon. I really appreciate this opportunity to discuss with you some of the critical tax and budget choices facing Illinois now that the legislative session has at least temporarily wound up. When I accepted this invitation back in March, I optimistically expected that the message of this talk was going to be, good for you, Illinois legislature. You stayed on course. You're keeping the states, towards keeping the state's finances on a good course. Finally, you made the politically tough decision to extend the 2011 tax increases. You did the right thing. Now, here's some information to help you defend it. Didn't quite work out that way. This debate is clearly going to go on for some time, clearly for the rest of the year and probably for quite a long time after that. But while the context of this talk may be a little different than what I expected, my goal is the same, really. I want to provide you with some information that I hope will help the policymakers and more importantly, the advocates in this room clearly and persuasively make the case that the Illinois' economic recovery really depends on two things. It really does depend on stabilizing its finances after a very long period of time of chronic budget deficits that have been papered over with a lot of gimmicks. And number two, and more importantly, preserving its investments in education and roads and all the other critical services that make a state a place where businesses want to invest and people want to raise their families. And doing these things will help boost the state's economy and create jobs. And letting taxes drop back to where they were in 2010 will do just the opposite. Illinois will sacrifice its hard-won gains and seriously damage its economic future if it allows these investments to deteriorate because there's enough revenue to maintain them. So I've spent a lot of time the past 2 years researching and writing about the relationships between state and local taxes, state and local services, and state economic growth. And one thing that's really struck me is just that there's a huge disconnect between what unbiased research says about these issues, and there's a ton of unbiased research, and how they're discussed in the political arena. So most of what I'm going to focus on today is debunking the claim that having the lowest possible taxes is the surest route to a healthy state economy. And really almost every month, some solid new research emerges that shows this claim to just be ever more dubious. So the first point I want to make is that the whole discussion about these relationships, I think, is often sort of built on a false framing of the issue. And surprisingly, it's false framing that people on all sides of the debate, I think, can sometimes be guilty of. So people on one side, it happens to be my side, but people on one side sometimes say, well, that we need good public services to attract businesses to this state. While people on the other side say, well, we need the lowest possible taxes to attract businesses to this state. And the shared assumption there is that the key to economic development and job creation is attracting businesses from other states. But this really flies in the face of a huge body of research. And the fact of the matter is that interstate relocation of jobs is a very rare thing. Most new jobs are created by a relatively small number of homegrown startup businesses that develop an innovative new product or service or business model and then grow very rapidly. So like Illinois, California is a state where a vocal group of people are claiming that businesses are fleeing the state in droves because of the state's tax levels. But a recent study by the Public Policy Institute of California found that over the 15-year period that they looked at, only 2% of all the jobs that were eliminated throughout the United States were actually jobs that were relocated to a different state or went abroad. The study did not report that figure, unfortunately, for Illinois. They have it, but they didn't report it. But Illinois was not in the top 10 states that they did list, and in the bottom of that list of 10 states, The worst performing state had 2.6% of its jobs leave for another state. So that implies that Illinois did not have a share of jobs that actually left the state much greater than the national average, which, as I said, was about 2%. So what happened to the rest of the jobs that were lost? Well, almost 2/3 of the jobs that were eliminated during this period in the US disappeared because the business shut down completely, and the other roughly 1/3 disappeared because the business shrank. So the whole equation of economic development with attracting jobs from other states and the focus on whether taxes are causing businesses to leave Illinois or any other state is really misguided. Yes, it's true that the occasional business that claims it left a state or leaves a state and then says it left because of taxes gets a lot of media attention, but it's really not what policymakers should be focusing on because, as I said, it's a really rare phenomenon. In the same vein, another study found that startup firms, those less than a year old, were responsible for all of the net job creation in the US economy since 1977. That means that firms more than a year old were actually shedding jobs on balance in most years. And again, primarily because so many of them were going out of business. And so there's a huge lesson from all of this. If you want to create jobs in a state, you have to figure out policies that help foster entrepreneurship and help existing businesses, especially startups, get through their first crucial years, survive, and then grow. And as one study put it, states and cities with job creation policies aimed at luring larger, older employers can't help but fail because they're not based on realistic models of employment growth. Job growth is driven essentially entirely by startup firms that develop organically. Okay, so these observations take us right to the heart of the debate about extending the personal income tax increase here. And I'll talk about the corporate income tax increase later. So most of you probably know that the vast majority of small businesses and startup businesses in this country are formed as so-called pass-through businesses. They're sole proprietorships, they're partnerships, S corporations, limited liability companies. And that means they aren't subject to the federal or state corporate income tax. Instead, their profits are passed through the business onto the personal income tax returns of their owners. And so you'll hear the argument, and you've heard it here, that reducing the income tax back to the 2010 level will help startups to succeed and small business generally to create jobs. So what's wrong with that argument? Well, number one, if you want to reduce the taxes of small business owners who are owners of pass-through businesses, cutting income taxes across the board is a very wasteful, costly, and inefficient and unfocused strategy, because less than 3% of all the taxpayers in the United States own a real, functioning small business with even a single paid employee other than the owner. Just 3% of Americans own a business with employees. And many of the people in that tiny 3% are themselves just passive investors in that business. They have no authority to make decisions about whether to create jobs. And so most of the other 97% are people who may work self-employed part-time, or even if they're full-time, there may be a plumber or an accountant or so on, but they don't have any employees, and they have no intention or desire to hire anyone. And so even for those small pass-through businesses that do have some employees, only a tiny proportion of them have real job creation potential, significant job creation potential. And that's because most of these businesses serve an entirely local market for a good or service, and that's what they want to do. That's their objective. So think of a restaurant owner. If a restaurant owner decides to open another location and it's successful, it's probably only going to take away business from some other restaurant. It's not going to create net new jobs overall. So only a tiny proportion of new businesses are going to develop that new innovative product or service or technology or business model that makes them the next potential Google or Federal Express or Amazon. And so giving tax cuts across the board is a very inefficient way of helping the very few businesses that have the potential to create a meaningful number of jobs. Which takes me to the next point, which is that even if you could somehow limit tax cuts to those kinds of businesses, you wouldn't be doing them much good anyway, because they have so little taxable profit to begin with. Just 13% of small businesses make more than $50,000 per year in profits, and the rest make less than that, or they lose money. So even at the current 5% Illinois income tax rate, the owners of a business with $200,000 in profit is paying at most $10,000 in Illinois income tax on that. So if the profit were on that business were allowed to fall back to 3%, in 15 years, or I forget the exact time frame when that's supposed to happen, 2024, I think, maybe 10 years. I mean, that means that business is going to save about $4,000 on its taxes. And, undoubtedly they would like to have that money, but that's clearly not enough additional cash flow to, hire someone at the minimum wage for even more than a few months. And so, it's just, again, there's no significant job creation potential. It's scattering small tax cuts around to a lot of businesses like that. And even there, that example I gave, that's a business with, 4 times the profit, more than 4 times the profit of most small businesses. All right, so what about the small business startups that are engaged in real innovation and do have potential to grow and generate a large number of jobs? The firms that the trade likes to call the gazelle companies, the Amazons and the Googles. Well, in fact, they're likely to have even less profit than the average small business. They're plowing all their cash flow back into R&D, they're marketing, they're hiring new employees, and so they often go through a long phase where they have no profit, and that's why they need to get venture capital. That's what sees them through this period. So here again, personal income tax cuts are just not an effective way to help these rapidly growing firms. And then finally, some say that even if tax cuts don't stimulate the creation of businesses that wouldn't otherwise be created, they could still attract to a state entrepreneurs who might be on the cusp of starting the next Amazon that wouldn't otherwise choose to locate in the state. That's another argument that is heard. But I've looked in depth at the research on the location decisions of entrepreneurs, and the evidence is overwhelming that most of them start their businesses where they already are, where they live, where they know the market, where they have personal relationships with bankers and investors and the people who could become their partners or their employees. So really great example of this. Earlier, just a couple months ago, a company called Endeavor Insight is a research firm that specializes in entrepreneurship. Did a survey of the Inc. magazine, a sample of the Inc. magazine 500, the fastest growing companies in the United States. And if you're going to read one thing as a result of what I'm talking about today, go get this report. It was called "What Do the Best Entrepreneurs Want in a City?" What do the best entrepreneurs want in a city? It's by Endeavor, and you Google it, it'll be the first thing that pops up. And this survey found that the most common reason cited by entrepreneurs for launching their businesses in a given city was that that's where they lived at the time. The typical entrepreneur had lived in the city where he or she had started the business for 7 years before they started the business. And after they started the business, almost 90% of these rapidly growing businesses were still located in the city where they'd been founded. And so again, this is just really strong evidence that, trying to lure people to your state or to your city with tax cuts, is not an effective strategy. And in fact, this survey found that only 5% of the entrepreneurs they surveyed even cited low taxes as a factor in deciding where to launch their company. Just 5%. And only 2% mentioned business-friendly regulations and other government policies. They did a mapping in their survey of the things that people talked about. One of these maps where the words the words are bigger depending upon how often they're named by the people when they do an open-ended survey. And restaurants was bigger than taxes. So again, that's it's a good indication that sort of quality of life factors matter to a lot of potential entrepreneurs more than taxes do. So to summarize so far, cutting income taxes will not have any significant impact on the ability of a state to stimulate job creation either by existing small businesses or to attract or give birth to these new kinds of entrepreneurial firms that have the potential to generate a large number of jobs. So that's the small business situation, and I hope that's some useful information for you, ammunition when you hear in the debate that's going to be ongoing that we've got to get the income tax rate back down to 3% because that's really what's going to create jobs in small businesses. But let's talk about the other argument you hear. That cutting state income taxes will dissuade people from leaving the state or will attract people to the state to live. Because that's the other major sort of rationale that we're hearing these days for keeping state income taxes low. And this is an issue that's been extensively studied by economists. It's one I've spent much of the last year researching for a paper I put out last month. And the research strongly shows that state taxes have no more than a negligible impact on people moving from state to state. And by that I mean that the effect is just too small really to be worthy of even attention, in my opinion, from policymakers, let alone actually changing tax policy as a means of trying to keep people from leaving or attracting people to the state. So what's the evidence for that? Well, first, it turns out that the federal government actually surveys people who move from state to state and asks them the main reason they moved. And the vast majority of them say that it was a new job, or they were transferred, or they got hired in a different state, or there were family-related reasons. They got married, and their spouse lived out of state, or whatever. Less than 1/7 of the people in the survey answered, a miscellaneous, they were given the choice of answering other category that might have conceivably encompassed low taxes or a lot of other things. Like if somebody, people want to live by the ocean or they want to live in a particular school district, that's what they would have answered. And only 1/7 of the people answered in this catch-all category where they might conceivably have had taxes in mind when they answered that way. So even in Illinois, a state, that of course, like virtually every other, cold, snowy northern state, has had net out-migration for, a very long period of time. Even in Illinois, 4/5 of the people, for every 5 households that leave the state, 4 of them, every 5, 4 come in. So again, if taxes were really a major factor driving out migration, why would anyone move back into a state if taxes were driving them out? And yet, we see all across the country that the vast majority of people who leave a state are replaced by people moving in. So I think that's the second piece of evidence that the taxes are not a major factor. Third, in this research I did, I looked at the relationship between housing costs and tax costs. And so, not surprisingly, the 2 biggest destinations for people leaving Illinois in the past 20 years have been Arizona and Florida, like, again, for most of the northern states, no surprise. But I found that if a typical family with $75,000 income had sold their house in Chicago in 2010 and bought one in Phoenix, their savings on their mortgage payment would have been about twice what they would have saved in taxes. And if that same family had sold their house in Chicago and bought a house in Miami, the tax savings and the mortgage savings would have been roughly equivalent. So, as we know from the survey that I cited a minute ago and all the other research, reducing cost of living is not, cited by people as the major reason that they moved. But even for those people for whom it might be, the numbers that I just cited basically indicate that we can make a lot more plausible case that people who are leaving Illinois to live in Florida and Arizona are doing it, if they're doing it to reduce their cost of living at all, they're doing it to save on their housing more so than they are on their taxes. So that's another piece of it. And then, there's a lot more detailed data in my report that undermines this simplistic claim that interstate differences in tax levels are a major driver of interstate moves. So, if this is an issue you're interested in, or you're confronting a legislator who's making this argument, take a look at the report. But it's a very long, detailed report. But I can't resist offering my favorite example from this report, though. So it turns out that from 2008 to 2012, 30% of the people who moved from Texas, which is a state without an income tax, to California, which is the state that has the highest top income tax rate in the country. 30% of the people who moved from Texas to California had incomes above $100,000. Only 21% of the people who moved from California to Texas had incomes that high. So disproportionately, upper income people are moving from Texas without an income tax to California with the highest income tax rate in the country. So that's kind of my favorite factoid. And I just don't see, when you see things like that, and there's a lot more data like that, a lot more examples in this report. I don't see how that, well, obviously it doesn't bolster the case that high taxes on the rich are driving them to leave. And finally, I did a very detailed review of all the major academic literature on this question, and again, it shows overwhelmingly that that taxes are not a major, state and local taxes are not a major factor in migration. So, I'll just cite one study that looked at New Jersey, which was a state that put a millionaires bracket in place a few years ago. I know that's something that's been discussed in Illinois. That study found that the placement of that millionaires bracket maybe drove at most 70 people out of the state over a 4-year period. And yet at the same time, the state raised $1 billion net in revenue from putting this millionaires bracket in. And these same authors did a similar study for California that found the same thing. So the bottom line is no state ever lost revenue by putting taxes on wealthy people because a few of them moved away. And undoubtedly a few of them do move away, but it is nonetheless going to be a huge revenue raiser for any state that makes their income tax more progressive. The fact of the matter is, in Midwestern and Great Plains states, all of them, Missouri is the only state in the Plains or the North, the Rust Belt, that hasn't experienced outmigration over the last 20 years to the South and Southwest. Florida, it's not having an income tax. It may be icing on the cake for people, but for people who move there. But people are leaving cold, snowy states for all of the southern states, including southern states that that have income taxes and fairly high ones. North Carolina has had massive in-migration over the last 15 years, and it has the highest, it had until very recently, the highest income tax rate of any state in the Sun Belt. And it's been a huge net in-migration state. So, again, just I think very compelling evidence that the taxes are just not a major factor in migration. So let me turn briefly to the issue of extending the corporate income tax increase because that's part of the debate here too. And it's true that a somewhat greater share of the studies of the impact of state corporate taxes on economic growth find there can be a small negative impact, and that's not surprising. As I pointed out a minute ago, with with the personal income taxes, very few people are subject to personal income taxes are business owners. So you wouldn't expect personal income tax cuts to have much effect on job creation. But corporate income taxes, the people, the businesses paying them are potential job creators. So you'd expect a slightly greater impact. But again, even here, the research shows that at most it's a very small impact on economic performance and state economic performance. And again, that shouldn't be surprising either, because we know that, state corporate income tax, all state and local taxes paid by businesses are only about 3 or 4% of their expenses at most on average, and the corporate income tax is about 1/10 of that 3 or 4%. And so the effect of corporate income tax policy on economic growth, is swamped by the interstate differences in the costs of things like energy and transportation and real estate and labor, all of which are much bigger cost items for businesses. But, leaving all this aside, reducing the Illinois corporate income tax rate back down to the 2010 level will have virtually zero impact on the incentives corporations have to invest and create jobs in this state. Almost completely ignored in the entire discussion that I've seen here, including, some papers by some, fairly prominent policy analysts who, I would have hoped understood the policy a little bit better, is that Illinois, since 2000, has only taxed corporate income in proportion to the corporation's sales in the state. In Wong speak, my language, Illinois uses a single sales factor apportionment formula. So that means that there is already no disincentive for any corporation to invest or create jobs in Illinois as opposed to some other state. If the investment is going to be profitable, and it's going to be made because it's profitable, there's no disincentive to make it in Illinois, because the corporation's income tax bill in Illinois only depends on its sales here, not how much property or how many employees it has here. And so on the flip side, not allowing the corporate tax rate to drop back to the 2010 level won't discourage corporations, won't encourage corporations to leave the state, because their income tax payment doesn't go down even if they leave, as long as they keep selling to their Illinois customers, which they're going to do. So the whole discussion of the corporate income tax rate cut and its potential impact on job creation in the state is just really disconnected from the most significant, what I think is the most significant aspect of Illinois corporate tax policy. So I hope I've convinced any people in the room who were inclined to think that allowing the corporate and personal income tax rates to drop back to their 2010 levels will give the Illinois economy a big boost, that it won't happen. And I think, and for those of you who are skeptical of that argument to begin with, I hope I've armed you with some good information that you can use in the coming months to refute this claim, as you keep pressing the case for extending these rate increases, which are obviously just crucial. So, I want to use the last few minutes I have to making the affirmative case for maintaining current revenues. To me, the strongest case for keeping the current tax rates is to keep the state on the steady fiscal course it's set out on recently, keeping the pension funding gap and the bill backlog on a steady downward trend, and working to close the state's structural deficit. Tax increases don't hurt a state's economy, but lurching from fiscal crisis to fiscal crisis, definitely does. I mean, that creates the kind of uncertainty about the level of state spending and taxes that just makes it very difficult for businesses to plan investment and hiring commitments. But that's not the only important point. Failing to continue the current tax rates will cost Illinois money it needs to preserve and enhance the state's investments in education, infrastructure, public safety, and other services. Those are the real underpinnings of a healthy state economy and future growth, and allowing them to deteriorate further really will just be extremely harmful. I mean, there are numerous studies that show that public infrastructure investments directly reduce costs for manufacturers and stimulate their ability to create jobs. I mean, there are lots of concrete examples, and we kind of talk about these issues in abstract terms. But when people decide that public transit isn't reliable, that it's deteriorated, they start driving. That's additional congestion on the roads. That costs businesses that have to deliver their stuff on the roads money. It goes right to their bottom line. When publicly subsidized childcare slots are eliminated and people have to turn to less reliable arrangements, it increased absenteeism, increased tardiness. I mean, that goes directly to the bottom line of corporations. So these aren't abstract. We're not talking abstract concepts. The deterioration of public services really does hurt businesses, and they need these services to be good. A few minutes ago I talked about the Endeavor survey and how it showed that entrepreneurs create businesses where they live, and the implication was that you can't attract entrepreneurial ventures with tax cuts, and you can't. But the survey also showed very clearly that the people who are likely to become entrepreneurs were quite mobile when they got out of college and grad school. And they were attracted to vibrant cities with a good quality of life, cities like Chicago. And of course, high quality of public services are a critical element of that for these people. I mean, they want good schools for their kids or the kids they expect to have in a few years. They want safe neighborhoods. They want well-maintained parks. They want good public recreation facilities. They want short commutes, good public transit. And many of the entrepreneurs in the survey, made the point that not only did they want these things for themselves, but that these kinds of things were just absolutely crucial to their ability to recruit the skilled managers and engineers that they needed to have, for their businesses to be successful. There's a ton of research showing that investments in education in particular contribute to strong economic growth. A study by the Cleveland Federal Reserve Bank that was done a few years ago and gets cited all over the place. They'll look back over 50 years at sort of what creates strong state economies. And the number one thing was the proportion of people in the state population that had graduated high school and college. So again, education is just absolutely critical to that. So, in the end, it comes down to this. We can listen to the political siren song of reducing taxes against all evidence that this really matters for the economy, and with the full knowledge that that giving into that song will deprive Illinois of the resources it needs to invest in what really works, or the state can stay the course and build an economy the tried and true way by investing in things like schools and roads and affordable housing and all the other things that make a state a place where people want to live and where businesses want to invest. So, I know you all will keep up the good fight to put Illinois' fiscal house back in order. It's going to be a long battle this year, and I just want to say in conclusion that that I and my colleagues at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities are ready to provide you with information and advice and work with you. So please call if you think we can help. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Yes, hello, I'm Dennis McCann. A counterexample to your last point about entrepreneurs is Silicon Valley, where it was cheap real estate that attracted, and then there were no services in San Jose at the time that the founders of these high-tech companies started out. They were looking for cheap real estate. They were looking for something close to Stanford. So they had to fund the infrastructure investments that San Jose has made since, and all the other communities around there. So how do you respond to that counterexample?
Well, I guess I don't necessarily think it's a counterexample. I mean, I think that, number one, I think that, you have to look in detail at sort of what the businesses are. I mean, when these companies were starting up in Silicon Valley, they didn't need much infrastructure, given what they were doing. They needed, they needed, as you said, they needed to be close to Stanford. or they want it to be close to Stanford. I mean, one of the studies I cite, in the report I've done looking at taxes in small businesses, it turns out that Stanford went back and looked at all the businesses that are in existence right now that were created by Stanford alumni, and 50%, I think the number is 50%, 50% of all the businesses that have ever been created by Stanford alumni are in California to this day. And so to me, that's an indication, I agree with you. Things like real estate costs and access to, being close to a vibrant high-tech university like Stanford are the fundamental things that matter. But I think the fact that they're in California is proof that it isn't the taxes. I mean, I think to me Silicon Valley is like the quintessential poster child for why taxes don't affect business location decisions. Mm-hmm.
So I'd offer a comment. We can be like Kansas. They've cut, I don't know how much money from their budget. The bond ratings have gone down. But we can be like Minnesota. And Minnesota is doing tremendous things in education. They're aiming to have 70% of their adults with some form of higher education certificate. And they're booming. So we have a Midwest laboratory. And I hope Illinois is not like that. And Minnesota increased. They have a progressive tax, and they increase their tax on the wealthier people.
Couldn't agree more. I'm sorry. Yes,
first of all, I'm Jim Oberweis. Let me say thank you very much for making some very interesting and valid points. However, let me take just a slightly different view on some of the topics that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. I'm a lifelong entrepreneur. I've started a half a dozen companies, and I will tell you that taxes, in fact, are not the only consideration, but they're certainly the number one most important consideration in where I'm going to start a company or where I'd like to be able to start that company. Lots of other factors, infrastructure, schools, certainly important factors, commuting time, important factors, where my grandkids are located, very important factor as well. So there are lots of other factors, but taxes are the number one. And let me tell you that at Oberweis Dairy, until just 2 years ago, we paid out, it's an S corporation, and we paid out in distributions as close as we could figure to exactly what our tax liability would be. All the rest of the funds were kept in the company and created jobs. So very clearly, any change in tax policy was a change in the capital that we had in the business to invest in new businesses, new ice cream stores, more jobs. And when you look at those costs of jobs, you mentioned if you save $10,000 in taxes, that doesn't even add one minimum wage job. Man, you are looking at absolutely the wrong numbers to come up with that kind of a statement, because it doesn't cost all of what you pay for a new job, because that new job is going to produce additional revenue. It's going to produce additional income. The marginal cost in the first 1 or 2 or 3 years is a very small percentage of that. If you are left with $10,000, your cost of one new job might be, pick a number, $500, $1,000, because more revenue is going to come in, and that extra $10,000 will produce lots of additional new jobs, not a fraction of one job. And I could go on and on. Certainly when you talk about housing costs, that's important. You talked about the mortgage costs, but remember, taxes, real estate taxes in this case, are probably one of the very largest factors of those housing costs. So, some of us would like to think that taxes aren't that important. I'm here to tell you that in the friendly confines that I operate, taxes are an incredibly important factor. And even if we go 10 years from now and no change in the law occurs, our taxes, our income taxes in Illinois are not going to return back to the 3%. They're going to drop to 3 3/4 January 1 and 3 1/4 10 years from now. So it never goes back to the rate that we had until just a year ago, or 3 years ago, sorry.
Let me just respond to one piece of that, which is just to say that when I did this housing cost versus tax cost analysis, I was including the property taxes in the tax cost and not the housing cost. So I wasn't double counting them. And in the examples I gave, comparing total tax costs, including property taxes, to total mortgage costs, the mortgage cost savings were greater in those two examples. And again, the other thing I would say is I am not saying that taxes are not important in terms of any aspect of businesses. Obviously, tax costs are like any other cost, and businesses will try, like all of us will, do what we can to minimize our taxes consistent with the law. What I am talking about here is the evidence in terms of the extent to which tax costs really affect business location decisions, and there, again, I'm confident in saying that that the overwhelming majority of the research indicates that that taxes are not are well down the list of things that drive business location decisions.
Mike, this is a little off base. Recently, there was a demonstration at McDonald's. The workers were campaigning for higher minimum wage.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk to how that would affect us?
I am really, I probably don't have half the knowledge of that issue that probably a lot of other people in this audience do. I mean, all I can say is that that there's a lot of research evidence that I'd be happy to get for you that modest increases in the minimum wage are not, do not lead to significant losses of jobs. I mean, that there's so many beneficial effects in terms of reducing employee turnover, and that it's not a significant. The vast majority of the research indicates it's not that modest increases in the minimum wage, do not have a negative impact on employment. Larger increases, the jury is still out, and there are people who are otherwise, very strong supporters of minimum wage increases who are like holding their, crossing their fingers and holding their breath with respect to the massive, the very large increase that Seattle just enacted. But that aside, I'm sorry, I'm not a labor economist, so. Okay.
Believe you from the stage. I'd like a big round of applause. The first thing I kind of want to say after a wonderful presentation like that, and for those of you who've heard me speak, you'll understand where I'm coming from, is told you so. I mean, we've been saying here at the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability for years that there's really not this strong correlation between your state tax policy and your economic growth, that other things matter far more. But it's really nice to have the true national experts come here and give you the researched, peer-reviewed data that are both compelling and eye-opening. I mean, the bottom line when it comes to tax policy is that you get it right, so that your state can make adequate investments in those core services and those core public goods like infrastructure that really are needed to be competitive in a modern economy. Which means we need a whole new narrative here in Illinois. Looking at our state budget, the very first thing people always say is our state has a spending problem, not a revenue problem. Nothing, and I mean nothing, could be further from what the data say. So I'm just going to give you a couple of numbers on the spending side to try to put this one to bed forever. This year, if the budget that just passed is in fact going to be our final budget, we will cut spending in nominal dollars by some $400 million from last year's levels. Year-to-year cut of $400 million, which is nothing new. If this 2015 budget actually becomes our final budget, then spending on services in Illinois in 2015 will be $4.7 billion less than what they were in the year 2009 without adjusting for inflation. And if you're curious how we spend our money through the general fund, I will tell you, and you've heard me say this before, 9 out of $10 go to 4 things: education, health care, social services, and public safety. So, these $4.7 billion in current spending cuts have been implemented to education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. When that's 9 out of $10 you spend, that is where the cuts are being made. There's no way around it. That's number one. We do not have a spending problem. Number two, well, how, Ralph, can it be true that even though we're spending less on services, overall there's growth in the general fund year to year? How do you explain that? And the answer is very simple. Our debt service is growing from year to year and growing significantly. It is some $8 billion more than what it was about 6 or 7 years ago. We borrowed in the past to maintain our current expenditures on services because we didn't have the tax revenue to fund them. Which brings me to another one of my favorite canards: tax and spend liberal. Anyone heard that one? Tax and spend liberal? Is it liberal to tax and spend on public safety? Is that liberal? Is it liberal to tax and spend on good roads, on good schools? Is that liberal? I'll tell you what tax and spend really is. It's responsible. What you are saying as an elected official is that these core services, these public goods, are so important, we ought to raise current tax revenue to pay for them in adequate amounts. That's responsible. Borrowing to spend is not. And eventually the bill comes due, and it has. In fact, we've looked at how the state has utilized its revenue from these temporary tax increases over the last few years, and it's gone to pay past due bills. That's it. In fact, when you add the new revenue to the spending cuts, what you get is the reduction in our accumulated deficit that Michael Mazerov pointed out we've had. We've reduced our deficit, our structural imbalance, over the last few years, but we did it by using this tax revenue and cutting current expenditures on services. Now, what does the future portend? Nothing good. If this temporary tax increase is allowed to continue to phase down as it currently is scheduled to do, then next year in 2016, we'll have about $5 billion less in revenue than we did in our last current year, 2014. $5 billion. You think $400 million in cuts is bad? And what do you think is going to be cut? 9 out of $10 go to education, health, human services, and public safety. Well, most of our health care expenditures, well over 98%, are Medicaid expenditures. Can't just willy-nilly cut those. In fact, the federal government has to agree to your cuts if you're going to reduce eligibility, et cetera. So those expenditures, let's just assume, are going to hold constant. Well, that's 30% of our budget. Public safety is only 6%. That means two things get whacked: education and social services. So being fiscally bankrupt encourages the very morally bankrupt decision of balancing your budget on the backs of school children and vulnerable populations, senior citizens that are homebound, kids that are abused and neglected, people with mental health or developmental disability concerns. That's the services that will be cut. And I'm not making this up. If you look at the last 15 years ago, from fiscal year 2000 down to today, you will see a disproportionate number of cuts have fallen on human services and higher education, and now increasingly K-12. because it's such a large part of the budget and it is so difficult to implement cuts in other places. Then there's one other little piece of context I think we need about Illinois. We're not a high tax state, even after the temporary tax increase. When you look at our tax burden in this state as a percentage of income, and you compare it to our Midwestern neighbors or the rest of the country, we're lower than everyone else in the Midwest except Missouri, and we're lower than virtually every other state in the nation, ranking about 35th, 36th in total state and local tax burden as a percentage of income. What does that include? Every tax and every fee charged by any unit of state or local government to support any level of state or local services. So yes, your property taxes, your hunting license, whatever, it's all in. We're a low tax state. We're a low tax state that refuses to adjust the revenue side of the ledger, despite the fact that all the data indicate it's tax policy we have wrong. We're not high spending. Once again, when you compare Illinois to the rest of the nation, we are one of the lowest spending states in every major service category. So it's time to flip this narrative and flip this discussion, or I will tell you what, our economy will continue to suffer. Because I think Michael Mazerov made it abundantly clear it's not taxes that is hurting our economic growth in this state. It is not our tax policy that is impeding new businesses from starting. It's our failure as a state to invest in things like education, where every study that has been peer-reviewed says there's statistically meaningful correlation between your investment in education and your economic growth. Every single one of them. We're cutting it. And we're low spending to begin with. We've known we've had a structural deficit, another phrase used by Michael, for decades. It was first really published in Illinois, the fact that we had a problem with this, by the Illinois Institute of Government and Public Affairs in the early 80s. Our organization, the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, has been updating the structural deficit model. And I just want to explain really quickly what that means. It just means adjusting solely for inflation and population growth and assuming a normal economy. Your cost of maintaining your current level of services and your debt payment load, as scheduled, will grow at rates that exceed your revenue growth. Illinois has had this problem for a long time, and we've tried to paper over it because we've lacked the political will to deal with tax policy. We've done everything we could to hide our fiscal shortcomings from the world. So first thing, we borrowed against the pensions tremendously. That's how we grew this huge unfunded pension liability. It wasn't the size of the benefits. It wasn't any of that stuff. It was the fact that for decades we said, you know what? I owe you to the pension system. We're not going to put in what we owe to fund benefits. We're going to divert that revenue to cover current services. Why were they doing that? Structural deficit. Well, now we're paying that pension debt back. Structural deficit, worse. This problem can't be solved without solving tax policy. And I'm not even getting into the inequities in education and education funding. The fact that we not only are denying low-income children a quality education in this state, we are now denying middle-income children and upper-middle-income children a quality education in this state, which we should be concerned about, kind of. Not just from an economic standpoint, but from a values standpoint. We have the 5th largest economy of any state, $695 billion annual economy. If we're an independent country, that's the 20th largest economy in the world. The 5th largest economy in the richest state in the nation can't afford to deal with tax policy? The total fix, and we've run the numbers, eliminate the structural deficit, fund education appropriately, which means an increase, not just this current foundation level, but an honest increase. Put money back into social services that we have been cutting for decades. You know, now, if you're an adult and you have a developmentally disabled adult living with you, say you're a senior citizen, and that adult with a developmental disability decides to get violent with you, because that happens sometimes, you can't get help in Illinois. No more money for it. Right? So I'm saying putting in the money we need to have a decent level of social services, to educate our children, and eliminate this structural imbalance, and I don't know, pay our bills, costs somewhere between $4.5 and $5.5 billion more than what we have now. That is less than 1% of our state's economy. We are letting a net tax increase of less than 1% of our state's economy stand between us and honestly solving our problems for the long term and making the investments we need in education, infrastructure, and social security services. I find that unforgivable. But fortunately, we have a great panel coming up that's going to help us deal with these problems. And I get the distinct honor and privilege of introducing Craig Dellimore, our moderator, who will then introduce the panel. And I'm going to read some of this stuff from Craig's bio, because he's an impressive gentleman. I mean, not only does he have is really the best voice in show business, really, Craig. I mean, you do. He joined WBBM Radio in 1983. That's pretty impressive. And he worked for the Associated Press before that. He was in D.C. He's been an anchor, a managing editor, a legislative correspondent, a suburban bureau chief. He's currently, as we all know, political editor of WBBM and BBM News Radio 780. He's a graduate of Columbia University, and what you don't know is he's one of the most knowledgeable people about jazz in the entire world. It's an honor to have a thoughtful, well-informed, and frankly, distinguished moderator, Craig Dellimore, to come here and deal with us.
I thought he was introducing my dad. Well, and you know, Ralph did such a great job of setting up the budget situation that I don't have to do it now. And I'm just going to have the panel come up. I will toss out a couple of numbers just to get us started. No, I'm very much looking forward to this panel, and I think you have to kind of look at your. They're actually alphabetical order. So, Ms. Moffitt, you're here, and Ms. Mintle, you're there, and Dr. Brazier, you're first over there, or at least furthest away from me. We're working toward me. Anyway. I will also say one other thing. I'm keeping now, and I urge all of you who have cell phones to keep them either off or in silent mode so that they don't add a soundtrack to what we're doing here. I will confess that I'm going to be looking at mine every once in a while because some news may be happening as we are talking. This is the day that Governor Quinn is supposed to take action, or this is his deadline for taking action, on Chicago's pension fix. Yeah, that's the one that includes a property tax increase that the governor has openly said he doesn't like. And we have been asking the governor all day, or asking his office all day, we actually did ask him earlier today, what he's going to do, and he made it sound as if no decision had been made yet. None of us believe that, but nevertheless, we haven't been told. So I'm going to be looking at my email every once in a while because someone is supposed to email me when he makes the decision. He has a couple of ways to go. He can mandatorily veto it and change it. He could veto it straight out right. He could, well, there's 4 ways to go. He could approve it just as it is, or he could do nothing, which actually is the same as approving it just as it is. So we may not quite know what he's doing while we're talking, but I'm hoping we do. So anyway, thank you very much. I'm going to have fun because I don't have to do much of the talking here. But I will tell you that the general fund budget contains more than $35 billion in spending. It may not be a spending problem, but it is a lot of spending. The accumulated deficit for the fiscal 2015 budget is, depending on how you count it, just over $6.5 billion. There are some $650 million in borrowing from other state funds. That's something that's going to come back to haunt the lawmakers when they go back in September, October? November. Yes, hold it off as long as possible. But budgets, as we've been hearing, are not just about spending, they are about priorities. We journalists always try to report on budget matters kind of that way. I call it dollars and intents. But I think our panel discussion this afternoon is going to do that as well. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly introduce everybody first. That way, once we get the discussion going, we can just keep it going rather than stop to tell you who the next person is. Because I think this will be much better as a discussion as opposed to book reports. So first up, to my extreme right is Dr. Byron Brazier. He is the pastor of the Apostolic Church of God. He has been a businessman. He has been an official with the Chicago Housing Authority. He is chairman of the network of Woodlawn. And he assumed his pastoral role in 2008 when his father, Bishop Arthur Brazier, retired. Someone I had the honor to have covered a few times. So, and a great man. Next up, it will be our state senator and a veteran of this very, very forum, State Senator Toi Hutchinson. She is a Democrat from Olympia Fields, and she serves as the Senate Revenue Committee chairwoman. She's also co-chair of the Joint House-Senate Revenue Committee that's been holding hearings on Illinois' business tax structure, so she comes well-armed to this discussion. She's also served the 40th District since January of 2009, and she represents parts of Cook, Kankakee, Will, and Grundy counties, one of those districts that goes everywhere. And we also need to congratulate her because she has just, and I mean almost just, like within the last 2 weeks, received her law degree from Northern Illinois University. So she's even more dangerous now. Next up is Theresa Mintle. She is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce. She is the 5th president of that group. She directs public policy, programs, communications, and business growth initiatives, and, well, everything. And you may say, well, how can she direct everything? Well, she has experience directing everything because she was Mayor Rahm Emanuel's first chief of staff. So not only did she have to direct everything in that administration pretty much, but she had to set it up. So, and frankly, she'll never say it this way, deal with Rahm Emanuel, who self-admittedly is not a patient guy. So the fact that she can smile says a lot. And our last but not least panelist is Don Moffitt. He is state representative from the 74th District. He is from Gilson, which is, what I want to say, about an hour from, what, Peoria?
An hour west of Peoria.
An hour west of Peoria. which, you know, those of us who live in the Chicago area call anything south of I-80 downstate, but he really is downstate. So, he is a full-time legislator, a farmer, and a former classroom educator. So he can speak from a number of perspectives. He's been in the Illinois House since 1993. He's currently serving on 7 standing committees, as well as the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules, which is better known down there as JCAR, because they like making up weird acronyms. And he's co-chair of the EMS task force. He's on agriculture and conservation, armed forces and military affairs, elementary and secondary education, state government administration, transportation, and veterans affairs. And in his spare time, I'm not sure what you do in your spare time, or that you have any of it. But again, thank you very much for all 4 of you being here. And we're going to start with Dr. Brazier, because we want to start from the level that really matters the most, and that's where the people are. How do you see the actions, or frankly the inactions, of the Illinois legislature this year playing out among everyday people? I mean, what's the effect on education? What's the effect on the services that you're seeing? And 2 of you each are sharing microphones there.
Let me say that I certainly appreciate the invitation of being here, and I want to thank Ralph for that invitation. At the community level, what many people have been talking about now are ecosystems within a community. It's just not education as a silo. It's just not health and human services. All those things actually come together and fit together. And when you take a look at the 4 services that are provided by a state, which are the pillars of any community, whether it be rural or whether it be urban, you're looking at education, public safety, health and human services, and economic development. When you take a look at a progressive, well-financed communities, you have high education, you have high economic development, you have low safety needs, and then you have low human service needs. When you take a look at deficit communities, they're just the opposite. So what happens is when you take a look at these 4 and you look at them as dials, in deficit communities, you have, 1 to 10, you might have education at a level 2, you might have economic development at a level 3, and then you've got safety at 10 and human services at 10, and they're very high. These are not programmatically fixed. You can't run a program and fix these deficits. You have to have a comprehensive understanding as to how to turn the dials all at the same time. And it's not, well, I'm gonna deal with one or the other. You can't deal with one or the other. You have to deal with all of them at the same time. And you have to have a structure in the state and in the community to actually do that. So the communities have to now re-engage differently, as well as the state has to view things differently. And when the ecosystem actually comes together, you will find that the alignments are actually what makes sense. So if I can just tell you a brief story. I sit on the Public Building Commission with the mayor, and he was bragging about a new high school called the Back of the Yards High School. And it has an aquatic center, and it has tennis courts, and it's got, football field, soccer field combinations, got all those things. And so I lean over to a commissioner, Arnold Randall, who heads up the Forest Preserves, who also lives in the community where my church is. It's called Woodlawn. And I said, we have those same things in Woodlawn. And he looked at me with a strange eye. And I said, we have an international baccalaureate high school that's coming up called Hyde Park High School. Right directly across the street is one of the largest Ys in the Y system. Right across the street to the east of the Y is a Park District field house. Down the street in front of Hyde Park is a football field, soccer field, track combination. Across the street from the Park District is also 9 tennis courts, and Woodlawn has an 18-hole golf course in Jackson Park. And I looked at him and said, what's our problem? And the issue comes down to institutional alignment. If I took all those properties out to where Toi serves, where I used to live in Flossmoor, there'd be no issue. But only in an urban setting do you have this disconnect. And so when you begin to take a look at alignment and ecosystem alignment, you can actually, from a state level and a community level, you can actually begin to fix a lot of things because things are now realigned and people look at things differently.
Okay, thank you. Now to our lawmakers, because let's set this up a little bit, because Democrats in Springfield say that Republicans want to strangle education and cut spending for vital services. Republican lawmakers say Democrats just want to raise taxes so they can spend more. So let's see if we can get some dialogue going about what's really going on in the sausage factory. So we'll turn to Toi Hutchinson first. Much of the talk was about extending the supposedly temporary income tax increase. Is that the best way of balancing this budget that still isn't quite balanced despite what everyone is saying? And if that isn't the best way, then what is the best way to balance this budget?
Thank you for that. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I look forward to this panel discussion every single year. I represent a district that is urban and rural. It's white collar and blue collar. There are pockets of some very, very significant need, and it lays right next to areas where you have wealth. And I get to see it from Cook County, right in the center of the greater Chicago metropolitan area, and then I go out to the collar, and then I go beyond the collars. So my district is Cook, Will, Kankakee, and Grundy, which means I get to hear these things and how it impacts a district that really does look like a microcosm of the state. It's like a snapshot of what Illinois really looks like. And so when we talk about what is the best way to balance the budget, no, what we just did was the absolute worst way we could balance a budget. That's number one. Number two, the kind of responsible thing to keep things going until we could get some other things in place, which would have been maintaining current levels, would have been way more responsible than kicking the can down the road. Because essentially what ended up happening is that we did all of the budget gimmicks and tricks that we decried for the need for the income tax in the first place. So the smoke and mirror kind of phantom budget stuff that happens all the way up until we did the income tax increase in the first place is what we just did to get through, so that we would not, kill schools, and we wouldn't have to cut human services even more than we would have had to had. It's actually heartbreaking what just happened in Springfield. And the best way to balance the budget would have been a progressive income tax, which we all know is extremely difficult to get done because that requires a constitutional amendment. Now, the fact that it is 2014 and we are arguing about whether or not we should continue operating with a tax code that was designed for 1970 is a little strange in its think about that. What do you still do today in 2014 that you were still doing in 1970? Are you driving the same car? Are you putting the same gas in that car? Are you moving? Does our economy work the same way? How do we move people and things and goods and services? All of those things are happening in a 21st century economy while we're taxing for a 1970 economy that does not exist anymore. So we were really going to be honest about what it is happening, at the state level and where the structural deficits exist, and really we're trying to address those things, and we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation anymore. So what's the best thing to do is to come up with 21st century ideas and a tax code that matches the economy we actually live in, as opposed to pretending as though if we just close our eyes real tight and wish it, that we can make it so that an economy that existed in 1970 would magically come back. It won't. It's not. And as long as we keep behaving that way, we are lying to ourselves.
Ms. Mintle, if you would allow me to skip over you just to get and then you'll have the last word. Because I do want Representative Moffitt to be able to give his perspective too about, was this in fact the worst way to balance this budget, and is it really balanced?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be back. You know, you come once, and if you get invited back, it's one of two things. Either you didn't wear out your welcome, or you didn't get your message across, and they'd like for you to come back and fully explain it. So good to be back. Good to be here with my colleague from the Senate. And I appreciate the dialogue. You know, I think I have the answers when I come to something like this, have some notes written. Now, then I hear Ralph talk and hear Michael talk, and my notes get torn up because, you know, you're kind of looking at it from a different perspective, and you give us some tremendous things to think about. So always appreciate that. And Ralph and I especially talk frequently. I also want you to know that, you know, you read that bio, and I admit to being the second most historic House Republican now serving. Only Representative Leach has more seniority on me. So, you know, seasoned. I like that. That's a nice spin. And it kind of gets telling, you know, on that. Back in when Jim Edgar was governor, and there was a proposal to raise the state income tax and give some property tax relief, and there were 7 House Republicans that voted for that. And it was quite a drastic change in how we funded public education. And at some point, I'm going to get back to your question.
That's okay. You're doing fine.
Okay, great. There were 7 House Republicans that voted for that. I prefer that some called them the Magnificent Seven. There were some other descriptions also. I'm the last of those 7 still serving. I voted for the Edgar plan. I thought it was a good plan when he presented it, and I still think the concept was good. So that kind of gets it in perspective, you know, that to be the last of the 7 there. On the budget, the whole issue, in addition to being a former classroom teacher, being on House Elementary and Secondary Education, I have 2 correctional facilities in my district, 1 adult and 1 juvenile. Technically, with the last reapportionment, the adult one is 3 or 4 blocks out of my district, but I mean it's in Galesburg, and Galesburg's the biggest city in my district. When I look at corrections, and part of the reason for our population in corrections is because as a state we haven't done enough to keep kids in school and give them the education and the training they need, and I feel like we've let them down. Not that you can keep every person out of corrections that's in there, but if when we spend 4 to 5 to 6 times as much per inmate as we do on funding our children, it seems like something's out of balance. And so I come at it from that perspective too, seeing those correctional facilities right there in my district and thinking, what if we could have done something different? So it's hard to argue against or dispute much of what was presented by Ralph and by Michael. I also come from the perspective of, you mentioned you opened with the panelists to your far right. I assume I'm on your far right. Yeah. and I take my role as being the one needed up here to make this bipartisan very serious. so I probably come from a little different starting point. But I do think investment in education is critical, as a former classroom teacher, and giving our kids a decent chance at the American dream, a decent chance at opportunity. And my gosh, if we can keep them in school and get them educated, all the better. I want to say something else on pensions, then talk about the budget. It seems like it gets lost in the discussion of pensions. We forget to mention that every annuitant, every state employee, every teacher, everyone that's in a public pension system paid every dime into it that they were asked to pay. And they're kind of being made the scapegoat, and that's wrong. They paid what they were asked to pay, and if they didn't pay enough, shame on us in the state for not saying you're going to have to pay more. That's all we would have had to do, and we should have done it. So I think we need to keep that out there too. That seems to get lost in the discussion. Yes, we need to shore up the pensions. There's no doubt about it. If we need to make changes going forward, and I think we do, let's do it. And I think we can make a tiered system, and I think we can do any number of things. But I think we also need to remember that the state of Illinois has a constitution that has a section that addresses the pension issue. And we need to keep our word, keep our commitment, obey the law, and obey the Constitution of the state of Illinois. So if that kind of gets it in perspective, yes, we need to make changes going forward. Let's keep our word. the budget that was passed, and being in the minority, we have limited amount of input, although certainly behind the scenes there's a lot more dialogue that takes place than probably would be apparent sometimes. And I've, during those last couple of weeks, had several discussions directly with the Governor Quinn. Appreciated those opportunities about talking about different options, different possibilities, different things. I'm not pleased with the budget. I don't think it's realistic. I don't think it's up front. I think any votes we should have gone ahead and taken. I can't speak for the Senate, but I think the Senate was prepared to vote. That was not an easy vote when I voted for Governor Edgar's plan, but it was the right one. I was not prepared to vote for making the tax permanent. I was prepared to look at options. I don't want, and this was mentioned by one of the presenters, I am very concerned that we not slip backwards on any progress that we have made in paying the bills and stopping that erosion of our bond rating. And I'm fearful what's going to happen. It's not sound fiscal policy if we slip backwards on those things. And so that bond rating is very troubling, and we need to do what we must do to keep that solid, because so much of what we do is borrowing. But in terms of some of the borrowing that was done, I think the question now is what will happen in lame duck session. And any of those votes I'd rather see in just regular open session. So I think there's a deficit. It's a deficit budget. I don't think it's was the way to go. I was surprised that I expected there to be a vote up until the last about 5 days. That's when it basically became obvious there was not going to be a vote. I knew that in talking to colleagues in the Senate that if something passed the House, if the right thing passed the House, that it would pass the Senate. So in answer to the question, there's a lot of work yet to do. We have not gotten our job done, and quite honestly, we need to show what is our plan too, so that people have a choice of, if we don't do this, what are the consequences here? Because there are consequences regardless. There are consequences if we get further behind on bills. There are consequences if the bond rating drops further. And I do have, and maybe you've studied that, I'm fearful that there will be a further drop in the bond rating. So without some significant plans. And we have to, we want to grow jobs, we want to retain jobs, we want to attract jobs, and there's been some real good perspectives here. Mr. Oberweis made a comment on what he looks at as a business owner. I can tell you the thing that is most frequently mentioned to me, just randomly, is the permitting process in the state of Illinois. Somebody that wants to grow a business or even bring a business, that the permitting process is slow and cumbersome in Illinois compared to putting the very same business in any other state in the Midwest. I'm a farmer, and I like it when some of our seed any business you want it. I mean, you're glad to get it. But I was talking to a seed company one day and said, "When are you going to put another seed plant in Illinois?" And he said, "We're not going to." And I said, "Well, why not? We're the buckle on the corn belt. I think you'd want to be putting it here." They said, "Well, it's the permitting process. We can put the very same plant like we have some of in Illinois now. If we tried to put another one here, it would be years before we had all the permits that we need. We can go to Iowa in a matter of weeks or at most months. We'll have every permit we need. We can break ground and we can start building." So yes, taxes are part of it and all these things, but the permitting process is the thing that's mentioned most often to me. And then I think uncertainty. Will the taxes change? Will they go up? What all those things are factored in. So I'm concerned. It wasn't a budget that I thought was the right one to pass.
Well, thank you very much. And Ms. Mintle, it's time for the business perspective. And I will admit, it's a little strange for me to be talking to someone from the Chicagoland Chamber who is not Jerry Roper, but because it's like my life here.
Most of our lives, yes.
Yes, but congratulations on your new post.
Thank you.
Officially, it's August that you.
It's been 10 months, yes.
Yes. So well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Go
Thank you,
ahead.
Craig. And thank you, Ralph, for inviting me to be here today. I'm sort of the, I'm not a dissenting voice. I'm a balanced too. So there you go. Up here, you're not alone. There's actually a lot to agree with here today. I think what Reverend Brazier talked about with that alignment in those ecosystems is incredibly important, and it's something that the business community has been talking a lot about this past spring. And it's the you know, we need to think more comprehensively and cumulatively about what we're doing instead of in silos all the time. And it's not just this tax here, that tax here. It's regulation, it's investment, it's really kind of growing opportunity and making sure that we get around the corner and get out of the stagnation that the state has been left in since the recession. And I think we do need to think more, whether you think of it as an ecosystem or from the business community's perspective as a strategic plan. That's something that we don't really do very well here in Illinois, and our business community would certainly like to see a lot more of that. And Toi, you couldn't be more accurate about the description of our economy. I think that we really are pretending that it's still 1970, and whether it is addressing the fact that we no longer have an industrial-based economy, but in fact a consumer-based economy, whether it's the way Chicago has grown, still a very diversified economy, but certainly not one dependent any longer on, you know, the back of the yards and a few other key things that we used to have. Luckily, we are still very diverse, but we do have to address some of the ways we fund things, and it really does come down to making some tough decisions about how we tax and regulate. And also, too, on our inability to get balanced how much we are willing to spend on incarceration but not willing to spend on education. I think that is just, it's tragic. I think it's one of the greatest problems we have here in Illinois. So from our perspective at the business community, and when I say the business community, I represent the Chicagoland business community. There are a lot of suburban and neighborhood chambers that are out there. We, however, for Northeastern Illinois, are the ones that do most of the advocating down in Springfield. We have a fairly robust operation, and we're down full-time when the legislature is in session. We are out there on behalf of Boeing, United, Walgreens, Abbott, as well as a whole host of startups and other mom and pops who really are one-man, one-woman shops working out of their garage or their now college graduate who did not move back home, old bedroom. And so we span pretty much every kind of business, not only large to small, but also in virtually every industry. And what we're seeing is this sort of make a decision now about funding this, or make a decision now about this fiscal problem. And we're not seeing any sort of thoughtful strategy for Illinois. We've done nothing since the temporary income tax went into play to really think about where we should be investing, to think about addressing the way we raise sales tax in this state. We sat mum and quiet, waiting for, I don't know, maybe 1970 to come back. But so then we ended up with this very dysfunctional discussion the last 6 weeks or so, where it was, will we do it or not? Will we or won't we? And the fact of the matter is that we did nothing to prepare ourselves for this discussion. And I think not only did the politics come into play, but we literally didn't have a real answer for how we were going to raise revenue, make sure our state was competitive, create jobs, create new business opportunities. We didn't even think about what our strengths are. Agribusiness, we are a huge strength globally. We were going to tax sugar to raise $600 million. Oh my gosh, we should be doing everything we can to make sure agribusiness, from the corn growers to the packagers and processors up here, that we are just rocking and rolling, because you know what? We are feeding the globe. We shouldn't be doing something to disinvest or discourage that sort of investment. I can think of education. I think what we did with UI Labs was nothing short of miraculous. That was grown out of absolute desperation and necessity without any real help from our elected leaders. We did that because we knew it was the right thing to do, and thankfully we had a little bit of help out in Washington to make sure we got a grant to be able to really invest in UI Labs so that we can start reinvesting in industry here in the Chicago metro area and really the entire state, and actually all of the Midwest because of the consortium that came together. Those are the kinds of things that we would have liked to have seen in any number of industries, a lot more time and energy invested since the temporary income tax went into place, so that when we got to this year, we had actually laid the groundwork for some much more sound decision making that were much more thoughtful about how we invested in who and what we want Illinois to be in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years.
Thank you very much. I'm going to throw a little bit of news into this, and I will toss the question about it first to Dr. Brazier, but I would like anyone else who wants to join in. I have just seen the governor's message on the Chicago pension bill, and the governor has said that he is signing the bill as it is, as it hit his desk. Now, he is pointing out that the legislative authorization for a property tax increase has been taken out, but it still allows Chicago to raise property taxes. What he is saying is he is urging the city council and the mayor not to, but he also recognizes that they're the ones who have to take responsibility for how they secure the finances here. So, Dr. Brazier, how do you think the response is going to be? Because property taxes, that's the one kind of tax that can go up that doesn't have anything to do with a person's income. And if you're sitting on, no, it doesn't matter how rich or poor you are, if you're sitting on good property, your taxes go up, maybe higher.
Talking about taxes is very tricky because there's a lot of individual emotion. But everyone has to begin to invest in their future and in the future legacy of their children and their children's children. I told my congregation once that I was not just the pastor of the living, I was also the pastor of the unborn. And if I don't do what is necessary now in order to address their sets of issues, I would feel as if I did not do what my position allowed me to do. Balancing taxes with services makes sense to me. If in fact you apply it in an ecosystem manner, it will make sense. I've come to realize that people detach their services from their taxes. And if they got their services from their taxes, they wouldn't mind paying taxes. But because it's detached and because you hear a lot in the media about the gamesmanship that goes on, then people become leery about what taxes they want to pay. And so you really have to communicate this, the elected officials really have to communicate this properly about what the taxes are going for. If 9 out of $10 go for this, then that becomes understandable. And here's what we want to do with your taxes. Now, it has to go there. It absolutely has to go there, and people have to see results from that. And sometimes in the politics, especially in Chicago, where the politics are based, some decisions are actually based on your connection. You have to be able to work through some of those dynamics, because it can't be connection oriented. It can't be because I was sponsored by someone that I get something. It really has to be looked at being equally across the board, and I believe that a person will not mind paying their taxes if they understand the services that they're getting.
Senator Hutchinson.
I agree wholeheartedly. I usually talk about the disconnect between the taxes you pay and what those taxes are supposed to pay for, and the fact that we don't talk about that. But as it relates to the pensions, I wish there was more conversation about really what the elements were to that pension deal in the first place, and the fact that we are not talking about whether it was legal in the first place. So we're waiting on a decision for Senate Bill 1 in the courts that, specifically goes to whether or not Senate Bill 1 was constitutional on its face anyway. So we've been rushing to pass all these pension bills before we have an answer as to whether or not they're all going to be struck at the end of the day, because we are impairing and diminishing people's contracted benefits. And so, there are other elements at play. There is, if you show the fact that you're going to do this, then you might stave off a negative bond rating. It was interesting that we couldn't use that same argument for the extension of the income tax, because we know there's going to be a negative bond effect because we did not shore up our finances. Now, that was crisis mode when it came to taking people's benefits, because that's the counterfactual we don't really talk about, that we were taking people's benefits that they paid for, that they did what they were supposed to do, their benefits, and for many of them, folks who don't have Social Security. So that the fact that we're here right now, it's going to be very interesting to see whether or not that is going to be another question that's going to go, somebody's going to sue. It's going to go to the courts. It would not be responsible to bank any of these phantom savings until you have an answer from the courts as to whether or not that's going to be able to be upheld. The argument that we had on the floor during the Senate Bill 1 thing, it kind of hinged on the fact that, and I asked these questions on purpose. Is this the only thing that we could have done? No. Is this the least restrictive thing that we could have done? No. This is a debt problem. It's not a benefits problem. The problem is not the size of people's packages. The problem is that people stole from the pension funds decade after decade after decade. And until you come up with a debt solution for a debt problem, then what we're seeing is some more theft.
Well put. Does anyone else want to address that issue, or we will? Okay. Well, let's move. Don't blame you. But I do want to talk about the politics, because anytime there is talk about taxes, the rhetoric gets heightened, and the stakes seem to get higher. I wonder is it true that in an election year you can't have honest talk about taxes because too much of it becomes a weapon? If your words may come back to haunt you. Representative Moffitt, do you see hope that there's a way of talking about these things without stepping on landmines?
I'm glad you waited and I got the easy question here. Great question. Given where we're at, and one of the just notes I'd made, it's on this 22 years perspective that I have, it seems to me like that type of situation is getting worse rather than better. It seems to be more polarizing than ever. The mindset in Springfield is gotcha politics, and that's not good. I'd much rather see things solved in a bipartisan way. I never claimed to be a real good speller, although once in a while I'd win a spelling bee in a classroom in grade school, I think, but not consistently maybe. But I know that the word compromise is not a 4-letter word, and we need more compromise, and we need more coming together and reasoning. And you just look back over some of the people when we solve problems at that federal level. One name that comes to mind is Everett Dirksen, when would be able to work differences out over time. I guess he's the one that he'd consistently been against something, and then he finally, over time, decided to vote for it, and the press jumped on him right away. Senator Dirksen, how can you explain that vote, that you had always been against this particular issue, now you voted for it? You're inconsistent. And Dirksen, who always had a tremendous response and that tremendous voice, second only to yours, responded and said, "I'd rather be right than consistent." And what a nice summary. And in answer to your question, it seems to me like it's getting worse. I wish we could move beyond the gotcha politics. I wished we could do more on a bipartisan manner. An election year is always probably a factor, more so probably in the House, because everybody is up for election in the House. Not that everybody has an opponent, but so in answer to your question, yes, it does. It shouldn't. That's not good public policy, but it is a factor. And it seems like it's more so all the time.
Theresa Mintle, we are already acknowledged that we have a state that doesn't plan. But if it could plan, what does it need to do to help stimulate business and not just keep it from fleeing the state?
Well, there's a lot of things we could do, and there's actually states around us that have been doing this, and that is to actually take a survey and take stock of what our strengths and our weaknesses are. There's something called an SWOT, SWOT analysis. It's really, really basic. Your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your threats. I don't like that word, threats. And we don't even do something that simple. And I'll give you an example, and this comes from my time with Mayor Emanuel. Mayor Emanuel, we did a lot of SWOT analysis in our first several months in office leading up to our first budget, and we didn't have a lot of time to pull it all together. And one of the things that the mayor looked at was what we had historically done here in Chicago with the hotel motel tax. And many of you probably know that we've got the highest hotel motel tax in the country. And, you know, he said, I can't increase that anymore because, yeah, I get to tax all the tourists and I get to tax all the conventioners, but I'm trying to fix McCormick Place so that I can bring in conventions, and I need to make sure that we have an environment where people will come here, and the hotel motel tax is part of that. So he went to Don Welsh at U Chicago, the tourism arm here in Chicago, and gave him a challenge. And he basically said, I want you to put together a strategic plan to let me know what our benchmarks are, what our baseline is, and what we need to do to grow. Who are we competing against? What else do we need to do? And at the same time, by the way, the mayor was working with McCormick Place and the unions to come up with the really great compromise that got us to putting us back on the map for competitiveness with our conventions. And after a year, the Choose Chicago came up with a masterful master plan, a strategy to grow tourism numbers here in the city of Chicago. They were so successful in the first year that they grew hotel motel revenue naturally because the room nights were so much higher than they had been from what we were projecting just 18 months earlier. And in typical Rahm Emanuel fashion, he turned around and said, instead of 50 million by 2020, I want 55 million by 2018 in terms of our number of tourists that come into the city of Chicago. And in that, he could have very easily pushed through the council yet another increase to the hotel motel tax, very easily. But instead he said, this is a growth industry for Chicago, and by the way, for the state of Illinois, and I want to figure out what we can do to get ourselves righted so that we really are competing not just with Orlando and with Las Vegas, but we are competing for the Asian tourists who, by the way, spend more per day per person than any other tourist in the world. He wanted to compete with European tourists to bring them back. He wanted to stop the flyover effect. Everybody goes to New York, Boston, San Francisco, and LA. He wanted them to come here. And it wasn't just the hotel motel tax. It's everything else. It's the restaurants, it's the attractions, it's the rental car, it's getting more people to ride the Blue Line and the Orange Line in from O'Hare and Midway. It is so comprehensively effective in terms of not only raising revenue, but creating new businesses that have to serve this community, which then create jobs, and not just seasonal, by the way. And it was brilliant. And it was all about who are we as a city, what do we want to be, what is one of our growth sectors, and let's go at it. And the revenue is off the charts, not to mention the jobs in that industry. Now, are service jobs the best jobs to be growing? Probably not, but they're jobs. And I've learned in this job now at the Chamber how much a guy working at the door of the Hyatt makes every year. It's pretty astonishing, actually. They do pretty well, most of those folks. But it was a growth. And then he turned around and he did the same thing with UI Labs. We have a history of being a strong industrial city, and we've lost that over time. And he said, we've got to bring that back because those are jobs that pay very well, and we still have the backbone to be able to have an industrial economy. That's what UI Labs was about. It wasn't just about going out and finding, some European industrialists to get them to locate their North American headquarters here in Chicago. Yeah, we've already done that actually a couple times. What he wanted to do was to educate people, was to make sure that there was job creation going on, was to make sure that industries were building or expanding, which would grow our property tax base. I mean, it really is more about growing the base and being competitive as opposed to just increasing revenue through some means, which is usually a tax or a fee. I think that there's lessons in that for the entire state of Illinois. In fact, I will go out one little ripple with President Tony Preckwinkle. President Preckwinkle has an economic development advisory board, which is doing gangbusters work. She, as an offshoot to that, she has actually put together a transportation planning task force, and I'm a member of that. Cook County hasn't had a transportation master plan in 70 years. She was blown over by that, and she said that's not how we can maintain our competitiveness here in Cook County, when it probably helps explain why so much of the transportation distribution and logistics is right over the border in Will County. So we're working on that right now, and the amount of work that we're doing to really drill down and understand what our competitive position is. This is not about, we want to extend the red line, we want to extend this metro line, we need more pace buses, what's the revenue source? That is the last thing that's on our agenda. What we're really looking at is multimodal opportunities for growth via corridors, via bicycles, via walking, via freight rail, via airports, via water, all of that, and really trying to understand what do we need to have here in Cook County so that we can be competitive, not only with our neighboring counties and states, but again, to be a global, really a globally positioned engine for transportation, distribution, and logistics, which is a huge growth sector for us here. We can do this in Illinois. There is no reason why we can't take these two types of models and do this in Illinois in a way that makes our entire state competitive, whether it's agribusiness, whether it's energy, whether it's higher education. My God, we've got an amazing higher education system. Our disinvestment in that is going to come back to bite us tomorrow, I'm telling you. I think that we've got a lot of really good examples where this works to our advantage, and I think that through folks like Representative Moffitt and Senator Toi Hutchinson, we can get this done at the state level, and that's what we need to do.
Thank you. Senator Hutchinson.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I want to add one thing to that, though. Raising the minimum wage. When people can afford to participate in this economy that we're trying to build so that we can be competitive, and they can afford, like, if I can't afford to go out to dinner, then the restaurant doesn't need more waitresses. If I can't afford to buy a TV, then Best Buy closes. So job creators really are consumers. And if we're not paying attention to what consumers can do, what our buying power is. So when somebody talks about the policies about, behind the raising the minimum wage, and you'll say, well, somebody who's living 134% of poverty, nobody knows what 134% of poverty is. But I know that if you are earning the level of minimum wage right now that we have, that's about $17,000 a year. I know a one-bedroom market rate apartment in Kankakee with just one bedroom is about $513 a month. So that leaves you with about a little over 10 grand to live the whole rest of the life on. Now, that person now needs food stamps, medical card, healthcare. You have the whole circle of services that we then pay for. Now, the same folks that want us to cut those services are also against raising the minimum wage. It's like either we pay people to be as independent as they can, or we're going to subsidize it. So, as Abby earlier today, you asked a question about can we look at what raising the minimum wage would do. Right now, because the minimum wage wasn't ever attached to CPI, we didn't have any inflation protection, we didn't have any of those things. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of people who could be less reliant on the state and would then have the buyable power to go in and increase business. It's like if you the little coffee shop owner who basically serves teachers and people in the neighborhood and the folks that stop there for coffee in the morning, when you can't afford to do that anymore, then guess what's the first business to close? The little service businesses, the little shops, the little mom and pops that are in your, in your backyard. The cleaners closes, the coffee shop closes. Then you have these strips, which is what I see across my district. These strips of empty, vacant stores because the people around them can't afford to patron those stores anymore. One of the best things we could do right now by investing in the people that we say we represent is to raise the minimum wage so that everybody has a chance to participate in an economy that we say we're building for everyone. And until we do that, that's not going to happen.
I would be remiss if I didn't give Theresa Mintle a chance to respond if you want to.
Sure, I will. I'm one of 3 business representatives on Mayor Emanuel's minimum wage task force, which he announced a couple weeks ago. And we had our first meeting last week, and there's a public hearing on it tonight. I'll just shout that out there for everybody at Kennedy King College at 7 o'clock. We are, the business community is opposed to a separate minimum wage for the city of Chicago because it does put us at a distinct competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis the suburbs and particularly Indiana. When it comes to the state of Illinois, clearly we have been opposed to it largely because there is no plan. Minimum wage increase, uncertainty about the income tax. What are we going to do about sales tax? What's going on with edge tax credits? What are we doing with utility taxes? We would prefer to see us looking at this from a much more holistic perspective. And I'll give you a personal anecdote of mine. Mike, you referenced to Seattle and that they just did that increase in their minimum wage, which is far more complicated than it appears because they actually did a compensation wage, not a minimum wage. Healthcare and other benefits are going to be included in the $15 an hour. I was in Washington, the state of Washington, in January this year, and the state of Washington already has the highest state minimum wage in the country. And I stayed at a Hyatt or a Hilton, one of the national brands. I never encountered a person. I checked in via kiosk. I checked out via kiosk. And I used Uber to call a taxi. One of the things that you're seeing on the coast in California, Oregon, and Washington is a very rapid move toward technology. A middle market restaurant chain, they already no longer have wait staff. You order off of an iPad at the table, or you go up to the counter and you order off of a kiosk, and then you get your number and you put it on your table, and a runner delivers it to you. That is something we are very concerned about. I have a lot of restaurants on my board, and they have not moved in that direction here in the Midwest. We still have pretty full employment in the restaurant industry, but a lot of them also have facilities on the West Coast, and they're seeing a very rapid move toward technology. And I think that that's one of the things that this whole notion of thinking about things in isolation, we need to really understand what this means. We are not opposed to adjusting the minimum wage appropriately. To do it in Chicago, we think is a huge mistake, but to do it in isolation without thinking about the larger implications, I think, is something we need to weigh and consider very carefully.
I think, Dr. Brazier, I was just about to say that we are talking around the very point that you made at the very beginning, that what we're dealing with is an ecology. It is not one thing in isolation from another, but you wanted to add something here.
I did, and I think my proposition is that I believe there's enough conversation going around this plan that I am prepared to personally get involved with you in order to help this state, lobby this state to come up with a comprehensive plan. And I'm sure that there are others in the state, representatives in the Senate, who would not mind joining in a comprehensive manner to be able to say, we want a plan and we want it now. And however that goes, I am prepared to deliver from the community standpoint those representatives, not state representatives, but community representatives, who are interested in a comprehensive plan with a comprehensive vision with a comprehensive implementation.
Thank you. I welcome that. And I commit to working with you on doing exactly that. And we've actually been doing some of that already with some of these small neighborhood chambers of commerce, as well as some other organizations. I've developed strategic partnerships that have not existed before with the Chicagoland Chamber, everything from Chicago United to the Illinois Hispanic Chamber. I'm drawing a blank on a lot of them right now, but to work on things like employment in the neighborhoods, shoring up the commercial districts in the neighborhoods, everything that we can to create job opportunities. Anchor institutions working with, say, the University of Chicago, or Northwestern, or Rush to improve their supply chain with smaller suppliers. We're working on a lot of that, and I would love to have you to be part of that.
Isn't it nice that we can actually solve something here, or at least start to solve something? I think this would be a good point at which to start questions from the audience, because we have a few minutes left. And that's our walking microphone right there. And so, are there any? There's one over there. And if you have a question for a specific panelist, please direct it that way. If not, it's a jump ball.
Oh, God. She's right to not let go of the mic when I start talking. Thank you so much. And I have a worker bee question, and it might just mostly be for Senator Hutchinson, but it is how to get a graduated rate passed. And I'm not speaking for the League of Women Voters of Illinois, but as a member, I know that in the late 60s, the League pushed against putting the flat tax in the Constitution, but it is in the Constitution. In the early 90s, we had a Speakers Bureau that I was part of. We had a big coalition. At that time, we were called Progress Illinois. We were allowed to call it a progressive tax. Now we say graduated or fair tax. It did not come to a vote. So this time around, as you know, it again didn't come to a vote. There's a large coalition, hundreds of organizations, many of us ringing doorbells and talking to our legislators to try to have 60%, for those of you who don't know, of the state legislators to vote to put on the ballot an opportunity for 60% of the citizens to vote. And it didn't get to a vote again. So for us worker bees, 2016, it's another opportunity, but what would anybody do differently? What other coalitions should there be? How do the citizens help make something like that happen?
Well, first, round of applause for all that work. I mean, that's seriously, because the conversation that needs to happen, and we were talking earlier, like, when can you have a real comprehensive conversation about taxes? Because it's a hard conversation to have when you talk about taxes. But really, you know, our budget is a moral document. Like, if you want to know what your priorities are, then look at the budget. What you spend your money on shows you where your priorities are. And we have to be able to connect the dots where we're not just talking about random numbers on a spreadsheet someplace, that each one of those dollars represents a life in this state. You know, it's who we're educating, who we're caring for, how we take care of the homeless, what are our priorities? And if we're going to continue to operate as though we have a manufacturing economy when we don't, we have a services economy and we don't tax services. If we continue to behave as though we're going to be able to, you know, like I said earlier, magically bring back some time that doesn't exist anymore, we've got to have better conversations about what's really happening in our state. I love the planning part of it, because it's true. I think people sat back and they rested on the fact that they never thought the income tax was going to be temporary in the first place. So they just assumed that when it came time for it to go away, that there was going to be this magic vote to make it go away. They didn't pay attention to the fact that there were 12 people in the House that signed on to a thing earlier that said, we want to roll back these taxes right now. And when that happened, the amount of people you needed to pass it in the House wasn't going to happen. That income tax extension was actually killed months ago, not in the last 6 weeks, months ago. Because during an election, we spend all of our time putting emphasis on the wrong syllable. I mean, literally, we are not paying attention to what's right in front of our faces, which is that this is the 21st century, and we're gonna have to figure out a better way to do this. It's not working. What we have right now is just not working. So until we do that, until we have those real honest conversations, and I like to tell people that in an electoral context, I know what people will say to win. And I said this last year. I know what people will say to win. What are you willing to lose over? That's a totally different calculus. It's a totally different calculus. That means when you took that hard vote, when Edgar came and said, I'm gonna explain what this is, and he didn't dumb it down. He assumed that if you explained it by the facts that you could convince people to do what they needed to do and make the right decision. You did what you thought was right. And he's still standing. Nobody tarred and feathered him. He's okay. He's still here in the House. It's fine. He actually voted for it and it's fine. So to be afraid to have a conversation about taxes really underestimates the constituencies that we say we're supposed to serve. So if I'm gonna go down, I'm gonna go down swinging. Like, what are you willing to lose over? And it's gonna take that kind of commitment and that kind of passion on behalf of the people who are elected to do this, you know, every year, because nobody sends us down there to make easy choices. Most of the time we're down there. These are hard, heart-wrenching choices that we have to make. There's nothing easy about this. I know there's a whole lot of folks who think we don't do anything. We're all liars and crooks and thieves. Nobody cares about it. We're all trying to steal money from you. I'm telling you, look at me. I just finished law school. Nobody likes lawyers or politicians, and I wanted to be both of them. And I'm always like, till you need one. But at the end of the day, it's because I really do believe, honestly, in my gut, that my job is to speak for people who wouldn't be able to do it on their own. And so I'm very clear about what I'm willing to lose over. And changing our tax code to modernize it and make it actually fit the economy we have right now so that we can invest in the things that we need to invest in that will help us grow for the 21st century is something I'm willing to lose over. So we have to, when you're at the doors, call people who, you know, when you talk to me, you're preaching to the choir. But, you know, when you talk to other folks who just, I mean, sometimes when I hear the conversations refuting the wonderful research by the CTBA and what you presented earlier, I'm sorry, I'm looking at your last name, but what you presented earlier, because I spent all my time in state and local taxation. And there are people who just willfully refuse to acknowledge or admit real data. I mean, it's real data. I know you can make statistics say almost anything you want them to say, but there's real, unbiased, peer-reviewed data to show where we ought to be making tax policy decisions. And what we do instead is make political decisions. It's emphasis on the wrong syllable. And the people who are paying for it, it's all of us.
Don Moffitt, did you want to add anything to that? Having a slightly different perspective, perhaps.
I think, excellent summation of where she's at and being willing. Your comment on what she'd be willing to lose for. My wife is here. She was acknowledged earlier. I mean, that's history now. Not my wife, but we're going to have an anniversary in a couple weeks.
Talk about emphasizing the wrong thing.
Yeah. But going back to that vote that under Governor Edgar, and a lot of times my wife will come down midweek in Springfield, and the night before that vote to raise the income tax, I was having a great deal of trouble sleeping and basically laying awake, and at one point she said, "You can't sleep." I said, "No, it's." She said, "Well, why are you having trouble sleeping tonight?" I said, "Well, it's about the vote tomorrow." And she said, "Well, you know what the right thing to do is." I said, "You're right, to vote yes." And she said, "Well, why are you worried about it then?" I said, "I want to make sure you understand this could be a career-ending vote. Are you okay with that?" And she said, "Well, yes." I said, "All right, I'm a yes," and I slept the rest of the night. So you really summed it up real good. Also, you know, I certainly always want to hear, you heard tremendous arguments or positions in support of some changes here, Ralph and Michael. I am concerned about the business community, which translates to jobs, what their perspective is, and I always want to make sure I'm listening to all sides, what the chamber says, well, and like in my district, I don't have the Quad Cities, I don't have Rock Island County, but I have Henry, which butts up against it, and they are constantly talking about if people will drive across, from Rock Island over to Davenport and Bettendorf, if on certain policies, certain prices for gasoline, cigarette, we raise the taxes on cigarettes and then gasoline and different things, that it can cause some more business to go over there. I mean, they're telling me that. So it's kind of a little bit geographical too. One person said something about, maybe it was you said, concerned about Indiana, the proximity to Indiana. Well, there I have Mercer County, which does, of course, go clear to the river. Good news there is there's not a bridge for them to get over. But they can drop down and go to Burlington. So it is a factor, but there's some geography involved too. So, I am definitely listening to the business community, business organizations, and I want to tell you, Theresa, we have some long suits. We have some strengths in Illinois. We let people that are bashing us get by without mentioning it. Two of them, and there's more than two, but two of them, one of them's agriculture. And I tell you, to have the executive director of the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce talk about agriculture in Illinois being important, that is refreshing, and you are right on. And I'm impressed. And then railroading, we're the crossroads of the nation. They can't get to there, across the nation unless they come here. And that's another industry that we've got to handle on. And they can access the river by coming to Illinois. So we've got some strengths, and we need to build on them, but we're letting some other people define us, other states, and bash us and tell us what's wrong. They want to tell us that we're totally corrupt. You kind of hit on that too. And they want to talk about all the, the slogans in Illinois where former governors make the license plates, and after a term's in office, they have a term in corrections. And they want to talk about things like that, Kerner and Walker and Blago and Ryan. But there's something else. We shouldn't let them get away with that. We need to make sure they talk about, we had Illinois politicians set the bar on honesty and integrity, like Lincoln, like Stephen Douglas, like Paul Douglas, like Paul Simon, like Jim Edgar, like Everett Dirksen, who set the bar. And let's stop letting them get away with talking about Illinois is just corrupt politicians, and Senator Toi Hutchinson. So setting that bar. Okay? We can do it. And so,
do I have time for one more question? Or? Sure. Yeah. Okay. Looks like back in the back of the room.
Yeah. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters also, and we were in Springfield that day lobbying to get the progressive rate income tax on the ballot, and Representative Moffitt was on our list and we couldn't see him. But my husband and I did see another representative, a Republican, and we have been emailing back and forth. And I said, what can citizens like us do who feel like we have a realistic view of what's happening in this state fiscally do? And he said, well, you know what? He said, if it were an open, transparent process, I think the Democrats and Republicans could come together. And I said, well, what do we do to try to get that to happen? And he said, lobby the leadership and use the media. That's what he's telling us to do. Do you agree with that? And how would you expand upon that?
I agree. No, I agree. There are a lot of decisions that are made in Springfield that are made by the four legislative leaders and the governor. And for those of us that are rank and file, just rank and file, take, for example, what ended up happening at the end of session. We knew that we had the votes to pass it in the Senate. But we also knew that there was not the votes to pass it in the House. And I think what moves politicians sometimes is the constant drumbeat of their constituency, especially when it is attached to media. I mean, we live in a digital age. Everyone gets their information in 30-second sound bites. It is, and unfortunately, we don't have really comprehensive, in-depth conversations about the difference between a graduated rate and how it actually makes us look more like the states that surround us. And no, it's not going to drive business out. You know, we heard that today. We don't have that kind of conversation. What we have is it's a job-killing tax, and it's almost like if I'm a Democrat, we raise the income tax 2 points from 3% to 5%. If I'm a Republican, you raised it 67%. And you want to keep the 67% income tax increase. So when we're forced to have those conversations like that, as opposed to, you know, look, what really is going to be the plan for this comprehensive, you know, tax policy to move us out of how we can pay our bills and fund our schools and care for the sick and, you know, make sure people are safe, because there are only 4 things we have to do. I mean, we have political conversations instead of policy conversations, which is very difficult for people who really, really care about policy. So I would say yes, lobby the leadership, and I would say yes, use the media, because there has to be a counter to every negative thing you hear about taxes because of the disconnect from the taxes you pay and what those taxes are supposed to pay for. And until we close that disconnect, we can't have a conversation. It's not a real conversation anyway about what it is that we need to do to move forward. So I agree. On top of the knocking door to door and talk to constituencies and lobbying your legislators, and all that's a lot of work, and I applaud you and organizations like you that put that, the footwork on the ground, the boots on the ground, because at the end of the day, that's what it's about. It's about the boots on the ground. It's about a conversation at a doorstep to make people understand that they don't have to be afraid of this.
Dr. Brazier, can I ask a brief follow-up? What do you do for the people who may not have the expertise, the experience, or the access to be able to do that kind of lobbying, or to know which media to contact?
Well, it's really about the unity factor. So when individuals have never been able to move a system, but unified people who are prepared to build as well as protest tend to have a better outcome. So when you have when the 10 largest pastors in Chicago come together, and we represent in excess of 200,000 individuals, and we send a lobbyist down to our state representatives, it's a whole lot different than me going out. And as large as my church is, it still requires a collection of people with a consistent set of ideas who are absolutely saying, I want to build something. I can protest about anything, but what is it that I want to build? And when you have people who are builders and not protesters, you'll have a more harmonious outcome.
Yes, go ahead. Representative Moffitt?
I think the question there was on would it come down and lobby leaders, if there's any point in that, and then who do you lobby, and citizens. I think any lobbying you do is good, so I wouldn't discourage any of it. Leaders have one objective in mind. I mean, it's to keep
Stay leaders.
Stay leaders. It's real simple to state that, because some of the most powerful positions in the state you don't get to vote on. The average senator, I think, serves a little over 8 years. Average House member serves a little over 7 years. That wouldn't change anything. Term limits on leadership positions, and change how we redistrict, take it out of the hands of the legislature. Then you put power back in the hands of the people, make enough districts competitive so that balance of power could shift, and then the people have a real strong voice. And that's what we need to change that. Change how we redistrict, term limits on leadership. Say term limits on constitutional officers, fine. Let's go back to those corrupt governors convicted that, let's see. Walker got 1 term, 2-term limit, wouldn't have changed a thing, would it? Blago got a term and a half. 2-term limits, wouldn't have changed a thing. Ryan served 1 term, 2-term limits, wouldn't have changed a thing. Who'd they leave out? Well, Kerner, I believe, was 2 terms. It wouldn't have changed a thing. I mean, that's just a feel-good fluffy. Let's get at the real heart of it, and it's change how we redistrict, and then we'll start seeing the legislature responsive. And Senator, I appreciated you talking about the rank and file, and it's not just the rank members. Yeah, thank you.
And on that note, we are going to end our discussion. I do have a note here to remind you that you may see little envelopes on the tables where you're sitting. Those are envelopes that would allow you to make a donation to the CBTA. That's not me soliciting, but I do know that the center needs all the help it can get, and certainly Ralph does. But seriously, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you to our panel for a really stimulating discussion.